Okay, thank you all for joining us tonight. This is the Thrive Prophetic Imagination for tonight, and we're going to continue with the Thrive Project details. So our Thrive core team is our sociologist team of directors, which is Gerardo Martií, Mark Mulder, Kevin Dougherty, and then Elijah Zayu and myself as the Thrive coordinator. And then we also have a Thrive resource team. And I saw Leslie on the call tonight. Hey, Leslie. Sandy Washington and Leah Grunset Davis. Ravensworth is not able to join us today because they are going through a workshop with Pastor Mia McLean. Lucky them. But we'll be sure to share the recording with them after tonight. And as a few of you know, we recently have had our Thrive October retreat about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago, which we were grateful to have. Most of our meetings are virtual, so it was very exciting to see a lot of you in person. Some of you I think I met maybe for the first time in person. So it was really incredible to have that, and shout out to Ravensworth for hosting us for that. And all of our prophetic imagination webinars and that we usually have supports the Thrive work. So all of our topics support the Thrive work as well. All right, the Alliance of Baptist staff. I bring this up because I find that a lot of folks don't know who's on staff. So I wanted to share who is on the staff of the Alliance of Baptist because they are incredible in supporting the Thrive work as well. And they are the backbone and behind the scenes that you may not know about. So our co-directors are Carol and Reverend Elijah. Reverend April Baker is also on staff. Reverend Stephanie True Cooper, Reverend Brett Harris, Christy, Brett, and Stephanie all help with Thrive Communications. So any communications you see from me, they have helped me craft it in some type of way. Myself, Alexis, I am the Thrive coordinator since July of last year, but there has been great work that was done before me by a former staff member, Malou, as well as the sociologist team. And then Lilly, who is our incredible intern, and she has helped a little bit with our logistics for the Thrive retreat, but she's also helping with our Thrive resources, which I will share more about in a little bit. All right, so our Thrive Church announcements. This is specifically for the Thrive cohort. So if you're not part of the Thrive cohort, just bear with me for a moment. But if you are a part of the Thrive cohort, please fill out your Thrive cohort reflection form that went out in the follow-up email because we want to hear about your experience in the Thrive cohort so far. That is really, really important for the work of Thrive. We want to know what's gone well, what needs to go better, what challenges you are facing. For me, I would love for you to fill out the Thrive Retreat evaluation. So if you're at the Thrive Retreat in DC, I would love to hear your feedback about how you felt like it went. As far as the workshops, the sessions, was it helpful for your work in your specific context and things like that? Lastly, I wanted to propose a slight change in our cohort meetings. Usually for our prophetic imaginations, as I mentioned, we have guest speakers. I would like to shift to having almost just cohort meetings. So just the churches within Thrive meeting with one another to hear about your challenges and your successes of doing racial justice work in your own congregations. So if you're in the Thrive cohort, I would like to make that shift in November. And so we can all kind of gather together as Thrive congregations just to talk about our work so far. I will also say that will be after the election, which I'm sure there'll be plenty to talk about after that. So maybe it'll just be a time for us to come together and talk about that as well as we continue the racial justice work in our congregations. As I mentioned, there's a Thrive resource drive that is slow to get off the ground, but I'm determined to try to bring it together. That is what Lilly is helping with. So by that meeting, I would like to have a good amount of resources to share that we can all contribute to as we do this racial justice work as well. Lastly, Ravensworth did an incredible presentation at the retreat in DC, and some of you were asking for it. And that was my plan to get it. I just received it this week, so I will share out the Ravensworth presentation as well as the resources that they shared in a follow-up email this week. All right. Just wanted to share again our team of directors and our sociologists. I know people are iffy about whether they want their bio read or not. So Gerardo, if you want me to read it, I can. If you don't, I won't. But no, okay. But I wanted to make sure that we can see each of our incredible sociologists and their work and their background. Most or all of you have probably had some contact or conversations with them. But just so we know who's in the room, this is who's in the room, and this is our team of directors who are helping to lead us. So thank you so much again for joining us tonight. I'm going to pass it over to Gerardo. Again, feel free to put your church and your city in the chat so we know where you're coming from. And then we'll go from there. So I'll hand it to you, Gerardo.
Okay, great. Okay, can you hear me okay? We're good? Awesome. Great to see you all, and I'm very pleased to come to this point. This is part 1 of 2. Today we'll be talking about some things and cover as much as we can of some of the things that we've learned, as well as take any questions that you may have. So as I go about talking, and I have quite a bit to share, and let's just see how far we get. You are more than welcome to put in questions in the chat that Alexis will read through, and she will be culling together similar questions, things like that. And so she will be asking them for you on our behalf at the end of what I have for today. So please don't hesitate to use the chat to go ahead and make any questions you'd like so that we can try to go through that. We'll also have another opportunity. So November 12th, go ahead and put it on your calendars. November 12th, you'll be able to hear more. I'm going to start off today, and it'll be myself. Although Mark Mulder and Kevin Dougherty are with us tonight, I think I'm going to be the mouthpiece for today. And November 12th, you'll hear a lot more directly from Mark and Kevin. Even though not all of us are going to be speaking at the same time, we have been talking and sifting and learning for a very long time. And so what we'll be sharing comes from all of us equally. So we have different voices. We have different interviews that we have done on our own. We have had different visits, and it's been great. Sometimes we've been able to be together. Sometimes it's just one of us, but we are all a part of understanding what we have been seeing and looking at, learning. We have been in constant conversation and assessment over now 4 years, 4+ years in this process. And so as we talk, we'll be moving forward. Okay, so very pleased to be with you tonight. And what I want to start with is the incredible experiences we have had in being in alliance churches in the United States and in Canada. And there are lots of times when I have been in a setting just like this. This is a Wednesday night at Highland Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. And in Highland, they decided that they were going to do a 4-week class basically called Racism 101. Okay. And as they did that, it was completely led by people who were members of the church. Only people who are in the congregation working through these things, they are the ones who were willing to stand up and kind of do PowerPoint presentations, walking through different things, and then opening it up for conversation. In an evening like this, what people would do is they'd come. There was dinner that was served. People ate together, and then after dinner, part of dinner also was like singing happy birthday for all the birthdays that were around for that night. And then being able to share and talk, and then pray together. And then everything was put away, cleaned up, and now it's time to talk together. And so normal, everyday people who were sometimes they were a part of the racial justice team or committee or task force. These have different names in different churches, and sometimes it was somebody that was just asked who wasn't necessarily a part of the team, but they felt had something to share. And this evening, it was a local public school teacher who basically decided that he was going to run through different things that he had learned and resources that he had put together in order to teach what he wanted to teach. And I was very impressed with a lot of the things that he had pulled together. Now, clearly he wasn't someone who went to school to learn race, and he made that clear. He didn't have like a college degree, didn't go forward, but what he did was he is a learner and he felt responsibility. And so I noticed that he had this huge folder around him, and I went up afterwards to say, so how did you come to know? And he goes, well, I got this folder. Look at this folder. It just says race on it, right? He's also got a justice folder too. And this folder, he opened it up for me, and it has like pieces of newspapers and magazine articles, and he's got notes on yellow pads, and he's just got everything. Sometimes he printed out stuff from the computer. Basically, everything that he knows about race comes from this folder. It's the stuff that he just kind of pulls out to be able to work through things, and this is what he had to be able to do the talk on this evening. And I asked him, where did this folder come from? And he said, well, if I'm going to teach it, then I've got to know something. And he impressed me as a person who was not necessarily trained in all of the issues of race, ethnicity, immigration, a lot of literature that's out there and has grown, a lot of academic literature. He's a person who didn't know really much until recently. And he took his own responsibility to learn and to do what he could. And once he learned, his entire feeling of responsibility is, I want to know so that I can share it with other people. The whole evening, the way he framed the whole evening was his father asked him a question, and it was a question about race. And he started the journey of learning in order to answer his father's question. And of course, that led him into all these different directions. And what impressed me about this is that this is what the work of racial justice is in our churches. The work of racial justice in our churches is happening out of people who have taken their own responsibility, their own motivation that something should be done. We should do something, and taking that and then running with it to be able to do some good in the world, and to be able to talk, discuss, and sometimes organize with people in their own church to try to make some kind of difference in terms of the racial injustices that they see happening all around them. Now, I was motivated about this journey and understanding what was going on with Alliance churches out of my involvement at Myers Park Baptist Church. This is a picture of Myers Park Baptist Church. I have been associated with Myers Park Baptist Church since 2017, and there, Ben Boswell was who's still the leader. He and I got into a lot of conversations early on. My wife and I went on a civil rights pilgrimage trip that was organized by the church in 2017. There's so much more to say about that, but it was an unforgettable experience. And what Ben Boswell and the ministry at the time did was they dedicated an entire year. They called it a year of awakening to just focus on issues of race. They invited guest speakers, they had small groups, they had book studies, they had all kinds of things. And of course, he spoke from the pulpit, and the entire congregation was orienting itself around, how do we understand these issues and what do we need to do? And there are Alliance churches that have been doing this work for a long time, but a long time is still a relatively short period of time in relation to how extensive the problem is, right? If we've been living with the problem of racial justice for hundreds of years, what we see is that the great majority of Alliance churches have been doing this work for a short period of time, relatively speaking, but they've been doing it with a fair level of intensity. So for some churches, it started around the Black Lives Matter movement or a little after. For a lot of churches, it was the killing of George Floyd in 2020 that motivated a great deal of effort. And there are some that have still tried to kind of get their people together and working through things that have been even more recent than that. So 2 years 4 years, 7 years, maybe. But in that period of time, there has been a lot of effort to try to address racial justice. And that comes in relation to the alliance itself committing as an entire group of churches, as a cooperative connection between congregations to say, we're going to make this a priority. And as you know, the alliance didn't just make it a priority, they rewrote the covenant. They revised the covenant in order to include explicit language that they were going to commit to dealing with eradicating, white structures of exclusion, to really embrace and deal with these things, systemic racism. And the alliance said not just on an individual level, but together as an institution, as churches, as whole bodies of people. And so once I learned about that from Ben Boswell, then it started kind of ticking off in my brain. I have been doing work on race and race in association with churches since my dissertation. I started this work since 2001. Mark Mulder and Kevin Dougherty have similar trajectories, decades of studying race and issues of race in American churches, North American churches specifically. And so I started to let this percolate. And with Ben's help, we got in touch with the Alliance leadership at the time to be able to sort of say, I think there's something that maybe is going on with all of the Alliance churches. And to the extent that you want to take this effort to understand what is happening in terms of racial justice, we thought, what if we allowed a chance to examine what's happening in each of the churches, to do interviews, observations, surveys. And many of you who are on this call have been a part of opening yourselves up, being vulnerable, and saying, yes, we're committed. Yes, we're doing things, and we are open to people just kind of learning about what we're doing. Okay, we called it Thrive, and the Thrive churches have been all over. We had so much interest in certain areas that we limited it to 2 churches, no more than 2 churches per state. Okay, and that's how we eventually got to 27 churches who were the Thrive cohort. Now, you didn't necessarily know what we were doing. You just were willing. You were willing to be interviewed. You were willing to let us visit. You were allowing us to learn about what you were doing. And that's all we were trying to do. It's the issue of just coming to understand what is going on. Paula Dempsey was very instrumental in pulling names and people together to be able to derive who would be interested in becoming a Thrive congregation. And so she was part of that first year of pulling things together. And we, since that time, were able to do a number of different things. We pulled people together into annual meetings. So you may remember that we had time where we would get together just one day, but in that one day, we would talk together. We would have people share. Sometimes we had panels. There are times when you were able to talk to each other in breakout rooms to share and discuss about what was happening in your own churches. And what we heard in our survey questions, our assessment questions afterwards, is the most important time that we had anytime we gathered was the time for churches to talk to each other. For people who are in clergy, lay leadership roles, just to be able to hear and share what was going on in other congregations. The reason that's so important is because in doing this work, Alliance churches feel very isolated. They feel like they are the only ones who are doing the work. They don't know of anybody else doing the work. And in fact, many times I found out that the leaders, the lay leaders of the church, were often being contacted by other churches in the area asking them, so you're doing this, what should we do? And you're like, we're not sure, but this is what we have been trying. And they have been hearing from people because these other churches would say, we don't know of anyone else who is doing this work. So in a sense, the Alliance churches are doing the work, but they feel isolated in doing the work. Even so, the fact that they are doing something has made them leaders in their cities, neighborhoods, sometimes even broader than that, because there are people who are desperate to figure out and understand what's going on. So our connections with each other have been vital. Finally, in April of this last year, as you know, COVID interrupted a lot of our plans for what we wanted to do. But April of this year, the day before the annual meeting, well, we got as many people who could come around tables and to discuss things. It was a really, really nice time to see people in person, for people to meet each other, and to get sort of this sense of what are we doing, and how are we understanding our experiences in attempting to do this work. The prophetic imaginations that we've done came out of an initiative by the Alliance staff directly. So I was very pleased that we were able to extend the work that we've been doing by creating an online opportunity to have community, to experience some learning, to be able to connect with each other about different things. And we've had a variety of people who have been willing to give of themselves through these prophetic imagination events. They've been very well attended, and we've been just so grateful for the times that we have had. We've been open to how to go about doing it, but it's provided a touch point and a sense in which we can try to overcome the sense of isolation that's there. Some of these have been truly amazing. The one that Maggie Zellman did in talking about Pullman Memorial's efforts was just fantastic. They had just gone through a process of meeting in small groups and in facilitating, gathering comments, and they were sharing with their congregation what was going on at that period of time. And they took that material and then used it to share with us what they were doing and what they were attempting to figure out. And mind you, there is no blueprint for doing racial justice in the American church. There is no formula for how to do this. And so by people like people at Pullman being willing to share their process, we are learning together. We are being able to figure out what's going on. And in that sense, we've been learning as well. Our prophetic imaginations have been great. And finally, an in-person meeting with the Thrive cohort retreat happened just a couple weeks ago. And I'm really glad. I wish I was there. Mark Mulder was able to be there. I know many of you were able to be there, and some of the people that I've come to know. That was, I think, a really energetic, warm, inspiring time, and also a chance to be with other people, like-minded people, thinking, planning, being together. That kind of thing is so important. And so I think that part of the reason that this is so crucial is because one of the things that we've learned is how isolated people feel in this work. And so being able to do that has been helpful. Alexis has been so helpful in administrating, communicating, keeping us on track. And so we're really grateful for what Alexis has done. Malou was very helpful to us as well. Paula before. So there's so many different pieces and people that we do not see and you do not see back in the office doing communications, running Zoom, preparing materials, doing Facebook. All of it is a part of a team effort to keep us on track about how are we communicating with each other, getting to know each other, keeping the contact. The Thrive task group that Alexis has pulled together, I'm very grateful for that. The creativity is only just beginning about the kinds of things that we can do. Okay, so in terms of the core thing that we were doing, the core thing was to look at racial justice in white progressive churches. That's what the alliance is. The alliance is like it's the one that's committed to justice in some of the most upfront, explicit ways compared to any other group of churches in the United States. Okay, if you were to somehow put a line, make it linear, and you were to try to go with the most conservative and go with the most progressive, the alliance would vie for being among the most progressive. And that's part of what makes it interesting is if you have such incredible commitment to do this, what happens? How do they address structures of racial exclusion? What does it mean in a socially progressive church? And what happens given the circumstance that these are all dominantly white churches? The membership is almost entirely white. And in the churches that I myself have visited, you can look around, and there are churches that have one, two, maybe people who are explicitly people of color, three, maybe. If it's generous, we might say two families, three families. But by and large, the churches that we have been associated with, which is pretty representative of Alliance churches as a whole, and of course, a lot of other churches in America, highly segregated, which means that there are very, very, very few people of color in the churches. In fact, sometimes the proportion of people who are on staff, paid staff of the church, that are of color might equal the percentage of people who are in the pews or in the membership, right? So we have such a small number, and that is part of what we're paying attention to as well. So the core question: what happens when white churches commit to addressing racism? Already exceptional. So these are people who've been willing to say, hey, white privilege is the problem, but what they're looking at is maybe the white people holding up the sign might be a problem too, right? And so being willing to ask that and to look in the mirror so closely, I just want to tell you, as a sociologist, this is a very rare thing for people to do. People are not often willing to take a look at themselves with something that inevitably is going to be full of some difficulties, right? Churches are very open about this has not been an easy journey, and yet being willing to put yourself in a vulnerable position is something that is part of the courage of the Alliance and Alliance churches. The courage of Thrive churches is, we don't know exactly what we'll find once we start doing this thing together, but we are willing to open ourselves up in order for the church as a whole to learn from us. Like, we're willing to allow our experience, however much we may feel confident or however much we may feel successful, we're willing to allow other people to learn from us. And I can tell you that that's already been happening. That's already been happening. So people are already paying attention to what's been going on. Some of you have been doing it locally. Your pastors and clergy and staff have been out. Many of you have very influential positions as school teachers, attorneys, social workers, or even in your neighborhoods with your families. You've been taking a moment to pause and critically reflect about what you've been doing, and are willing to allow other people to share what it is that you've been seeing and you've been learning. That is part of the amazing aspect of this particular process. So when we also go to the annual meetings and we engage with leadership, we are noticing a lot of things. We know that there are churches that made very upfront commitments about being racially just. That can come out in a lot of different ways. One of them is having a Black Lives Matter sign, but it's not the only way. Many of you have adopted statements. Many of you have formed justice teams, racial task forces, or other things like that. Many of you have reframed your liturgy and done things with your music. You have done things in preaching. You have done things in representation, in like bulletins, or sometimes even the architecture. There are churches that have taken a look at their stained glass windows and have had to confront things that were going on there, perhaps exploring and even darkening the faces of Jesus or other people in these stained glass windows. At Highland, when they started doing some of this work, they found out that some of the people who had been enshrined in their stained glass windows were people who were actually participants in the institution of slavery. Either they own slaves or something like that. And so in doing that, they're like, what do we do with that? And being able to consult with others. In Highland's case, they consulted other people of color in the neighborhood, and they've committed now to placing plaques that describe who these people were and making it clear what they represented and how that's not consistent with the values of their church. Other churches have explored their church histories and have gone deep into the archives of what's been going on. At a place like Broadway Baptist, they discovered that there was a janitor, a custodian that they had in their church, served for decades in their church, but because of the racial segregation of their time, the custodian was not allowed to worship with everyone else in the service. Even though uh, John Thomas was his name, John Thomas was not allowed to sit. He actually sat in the baptistry every Sunday morning to be in the service with everyone else. He was not seen, but he was there. And the story of John Thomas is so moving to say that there may be these deep structures of racism in our church, but they go largely unseen. John Thomas is now honored by Broadway. Just at the end of this of September, they commissioned a painting of John Thomas, and this painting is quite remarkable. If you can find it, John Thomas is depicted as walking the center of the aisle, holding a Bible. In other words, the picture depicted something that John Thomas was not able to do in his own lifetime, was to be at the center of the church, integrated with the rest of the congregation. In fact, it was after John Thomas died that it was the first time that there was an interracial service at the church. But the records show that black people sat on one side of the church and white people on the other. And so there's a legacy there of uncovering, where has our church been? What has been going on here? And what can we do to recognize aspects of our past, right? Things that we are that may still be adhering to our structures, and yet we have not yet addressed them directly. At Myers Park, Ben Boswell has been organizing with the staff a Confronting Whiteness conference. Is the third This year was the third year that they have done a Confronting Whiteness conference, and they focused this particular year on reparations. Other churches have also focused on their budget, dedicating financial amounts to reparations directly, whether it's dedicating a portion of their budget or being able to take a designated amount and putting it to use in a way that would support reparations as best they can understand or carry it out today. There are hiring decisions. There are people who are being brought on staff who are people of color. Now, this can introduce other differences in terms of tensions. When we have spent time talking with staff and pastors of color, they have informed us of the different experiences that they've had that have not been entirely comfortable or complimentary. You'll hear more about that next week. So I encourage you to tune in next week. I don't want to short shrift the amount of time we should spend just talking about the Black experience in white dominant alliance churches. And one of the things also that we were able to do, I'll get to some other things in a moment, but I wanted to show you that Andrew Gardner and I, who co-wrote an article that was accepted at one of the best journals out there called Religion and American Culture. This is a premier journal for religious historians. And we wrote an article about the journey of the alliance in terms of its social justice. And what this article shows is that the development of the conservatism of the Southern Baptist Convention is directly tied to the increasingly progressive stance of the Alliance of Baptists. In other words, we know that the Southern Baptists are conservative. We all know that, especially if you're in Baptist world, you know that. But what you may not know is that the Southern Baptists and the Alliance have been in an oppositional identity. They actually have defined themselves in relation to each other. And if you want to understand the development of the SBC, my argument with Andrew is you have to understand the Alliance. And so we wrote this particular article that has a good bit of history. You may recognize names in there because we were able to do some interviews in complementing what the story is and pulling these things through. It's not particularly long. It is a journal article length, but it's got a lot of good history that you may be interested in. That provides a background for understanding what has been happening in our churches. We know that you've been putting it on the website. We know that you have reports of things. We know that you have not been quiet about your commitments. You've been public with your commitments. And I think that that's important. There are a whole slew of things that you have been doing as a part of doing racial justice. We know that there are book discussions, special speakers, racial audits have been happening. They still happen now. Civil rights pilgrimages, music and liturgical changes, hiring practices, and especially attention to voices of color. So that doesn't exhaust, but what you can see is that as churches began the journey, they would sit around and say, what should we be doing? And in the process, they have put together what they could. When they could not find materials, they made their own. If we remember from the very beginning, I showed you this public school teacher with their folder labeled race. I have spoken with people in Alliance churches who have created curriculum for their own churches in an attempt to craft something they could not find anywhere else. Look at the amount of energy and time that takes to do. It's the ability to say, we know we need this. If it doesn't exist, we're going to create it. And that's the kind of thing that has been happening. But over and over again, what we get when we do our interviews is we find leaders and members saying they feel stuck. They feel stuck. They don't know exactly what to do, or they don't know what to do next. That feeling of being stuck comes out as frustration. It comes out as in the asking of different questions. It comes out of sort of like a throwing up your hands. We've done everything we know how to do. We know that in the attempt to figure things out, we've often heard what I would consider to be rehearsed answers. How do you define racism? A rehearsed answer. What should we be doing? A rehearsed answer. And those rehearsed answers typify the sense that everybody is trying to do their homework on racism. And out of that homework, there's only a small number of books that everyone seems to have read. Everyone seems to be going to the same kind of things that are accessible, easier to find, things that you might find in an airport or readily at a Barnes and Noble, something you could pick off or find, and what's being recommended, going around as here's the book that you need. But it leads to people saying things that are remarkably similar to one another because they're not yet sure how to think about it on their own. So the rehearsed answers are a testament to people learning, but it does not yet yield a sense of creativity or even a feeling of independence about how people feel that they should be dealing with things in their own churches, sometimes even in their own lives. Okay. So they've read books, they've attended seminars. There is a fundamental desire on the part of Alliance people to get it right. That sense of getting it right is something that's found from the clergy to staff to lay leaders, even to members. There is a sense in which earnest people who believe that there's something terribly wrong in the world and it's been wrong for a long time are now trying to say, okay, what do we do to try to do things the way they should be doing? And they want to make sure and get it right. And that get it right leads them to being schooled in what they do, using the best resources that they can find or construct, not quite as creative as people who may feel a greater sense of comfort or facility or even past experience about what kinds of things we could do. So that phenomenon of getting it right took up a lot of my attention in the first year that I started working with churches, I started noticing the various ways in which getting it right and the earnestness of getting it right was so determinative of the identity and the activity that I was seeing. It's getting it right seemed to be driving a lot of what are the right speakers to have, or what are the right books to read, or even the sense of discomfort about, am I doing it right? Because there doesn't seem to be a lot of confidence about even being right in how we're doing things. So confidence um, has been elusive. Confidence being elusive sort of means that the racial justice teams of including staff, including clergy, are pulling together, doing the best they can, but they're just not quite sure. And because they lack the confidence as they're trying to figure out what else to do, the frustration about doing racial justice grows. What does it mean to do racial justice as a church? What does it mean for the congregation to be anti-racist? And that is not a question that's really fully answered. I think that it's something that's still an open question. And it's not unusual for me or Mark or Kevin to have been asked directly, can you just sort of tell me what to do? Because, people will say, I think action is important if you can finally get to that, right? Because there's a sense in which it's coming, maybe we're almost there. In our interviews, sometimes people would say, well, we think we're just about getting there. And then we've been around. So 2 years later, we're still, well, we think we're just about getting there. There's always a sense that the finish line keeps getting further and further away. It's always on the horizon. But as you move, the horizon continues to move as well. So if you feel that way, you are not alone, okay? You are not alone, because what the Alliance has been trying to do is they're trying to create a brand new church, a church that is institutionalizing anti-racism. Institutionalizing has a sociological significance for me when I use that. What I mean by institutionalizing, it means you have expectations, anticipations, there are role responsibilities, role distributions, there's understandings that are accepted as normal and right and good. There's a sense in which everybody kind of knows, yeah, this is just what we do. And it's not even fully in question. It's not entirely conscious. It's just out of custom, more than just habit, but just a sense of this is the way we are. Institutionalization is something that takes time. It's not something that happens overnight. Institutionalizing anti-racism is a multi-generational affair. It's a multi-generational process. And so, if I can remind you at the top, when I said churches have been doing this earnestly and directly, and they've been doing it with great intentionality, they have been doing it, but doing it for a short amount of time. And so if we put it in the realm of thinking about what does it take to institutionalize something, then I think that you could see that 2 years, 4 years, 7 years, that's a good lengthy amount of time almost for any church program. In fact, in some churches, anti-racist efforts are longer than the period that the lead pastor have been there, right? You may have had staff turnover. You may have had quite a bit of change in people, but the amount of effort that it may take for what usually would be a pretty long-standing program is very, very short when we think about a history that's required to institutionalize something. And because the institutionalization of anti-racism has not yet kind of, it hasn't really moved to a place where it just kind of snaps in. It hasn't moved to a place of assurance. It hasn't really become a current with a ready flow that people can just kind of fall into. Instead, what we see is the effort to institutionalize anti-racism is fraught, and it's challenging, and we can all admit that it is incomplete. Now, that is what makes it difficult, because we like goals, right? We like goals. We like to be able to check the box, right? And we want to be able to say, yes, we've done this. Yes, we've been successful. We want to be able to answer the critics. We want to be able to answer other people who see really, really ugly things happening in Christianity. We want to talk to people and say, but we're different. But as we have tried to do this work, and we have spent time talking, we started with interviews, but I think we have spent time talking. We've had coffee, we've sat around, we've had dinner. Mark and Kevin and I have wanted to be in relationship, and we are very pleased with so many wonderful people we've come to know. And that is what has allowed a level of trust that has allowed people to tell us stories and tell us about difficulties, things that have occurred. There is a fair amount of conflict that is happening in our churches. It is not something that you advertise. It's not what you put on the bulletin. It's not something that is the first thing you're going to talk about, because who wants to talk about it first? But we know that there has been tensions and challenges and conflicts. We know that it's happening not just in private meetings of people telling the pastor things that they would never say out loud in front of anybody else. It's also neighbors and family, people who are right next to you in the pews. It is sometimes meetings that have been happening outside of the church. Next week, we'll spend more time talking about conflict and resistance, but I want to at least recognize that the difficulty in institutionalizing anti-racism is because it's not an easy thing to do. And it comes amidst um, valid and important to recognize tensions and conflict that people have faced, even if it's not comfortable to talk about, and has often happened out of sight, right? It's happened in hallways and the parking lot, in other ways that aren't up front. If we don't make the conflict known up front, then you're going to think that you're odd, like somehow your church is weird, or maybe you feel like you're not doing it right because you're experiencing conflict and you don't hear anybody else talking about it. Okay. Well, this is a little bit like Facebook. On Facebook, everybody's life looks amazing, right? Maybe my Facebook also looks pretty amazing, right? But I'm not going to tell you the things that aren't so amazing. Okay. I'm not going to tell you the things that aren't so amazing. And churches are invested in trying to smooth and provide vision and inspiration. It's not the first thing that's going to be admitted. So we'll spend more time talking about it, but we have spent time, and today I just want to recognize that conflict is normal. Conflict in the church is normal. And in fact, Brian Harrington, I believe he's on the call. Brian Harrington gave a wonderful presentation in this summer talking about sort of the notion that the church is progressive, therefore it's not going to struggle, right? Like if the church is progressive, then we won't be dealing with these issues. And so Brian wrote up his notes, and he and I co-wrote something that you'll find on Faith and Leadership with the Duke Divinity School, and it's basically the sense of people believing, like, why are you talking about racism? Because we don't have racists in our church. Right. And so believing that there's no racism in our church is part of the problem. Okay. Just a heads up. Okay. But being willing to talk about that and the way in which Brian and his wife had experienced outright conflict over these things, and to be able to open that up is something to recognize. That article is free. You can find it by searching my name, Brian Harrington's name, and you'll be able to read. It's a fairly short, but it's punchy. It's got a lot of good stuff. Brian shares some of his experience, and he puts in some learning things that he and I have read together to be able to talk about. Well, progressive churches deal with racism too, right? So I think that being able to understand that is important. So I realize that probably the most persistent question that Mark, Kevin, and I have had in our time over the last 4+ years is, can you tell me what to do? Can you just tell me what to do? Okay. We have resisted that because we believe that no single person should be in a position to tell every church what to do. We also believe that, my ecclesiology says that the church is creatively working through things that are distinctive to what churches need to be dealing with, and each church is going to have different context for working through things. So I have been incredibly hesitant to say much of anything about what you should be doing, but we are learning things that I think can be helpful to mirror and to provide some sensitivities as you continue moving in this work forward. So, part of the journey certainly has been that people in the Alliance have been taking an unseen racialized religion and they're moving to becoming a newly conscious progressivism. Let me break this down just a minute. What do I mean by unseen racialized religion? So here's my approach. In American religion, I'm going to focus on the US, it's the context I live in. In American religion, when we talk about religion as if it's associated with race, it's when we talk about like churches that are immigrant churches. Like we'll say that's a Latino church, or we'll say that's the Black church. And that's the time when we think that the church somehow is affected, influenced, or associated with racialized experiences. Okay. But part of what we need to understand is the way in which white dominant churches, historically white churches, are also racialized churches. Okay. And being able to recognize that the churches have oriented around something called whiteness has been a real discovery for a lot of your people. I have interviewed more than one person who said, after going through a process in your churches, they will say, I didn't know I was white. Okay. That's a profound statement. When somebody says, and these are not young people. Okay. This isn't like an 8-year old or a 25-year-old. These are mature people, smart, have had mature careers who are facing a realization of something they had never come to terms with before. I didn't know I was white. Out of those kinds of journeys comes a sense of understanding the ways in which the churches, the architecture, the liturgy, the music, the decision making processes, all kinds of things have been affected by a pervasive and long-standing whiteness within the church. And being able to come to terms with that means that all of a sudden you're newly conscious about something which leaves you feeling uncertain. It's another source of anxiety. It's not something I knew. All of a sudden, I'm not so sure because there's a lot of things in religion that are supposed to give you confidence. It's supposed to make you so confident to go out there and win the world. But when your church is helping you to understand that maybe there are things about you that you don't know, and maybe there are things about our church that maybe have not been quite as God honoring as we would like them to be, that is an unsettling experience. Some of our pastors in Alliance churches have taken time to uncover and verify that the very building that they're in was built based on monies, funding that had come from slave labor, from slave wealth. Many of our leaders and members have in this process discovered that their families had owned slaves. They did not know that, but they had found out that their families had owned slaves. So then when you start kind of getting this process of getting a handle of how whiteness has been inherent to your Christian experience and your Christian congregation, that also expands the level of sort of uncertainty and anxiety that you have about, well, what does that mean for my faith? What does that mean for what it means to be involved in this church? What does it mean for all the things that we've been doing? So there's a greater awareness of just being white. And you come to terms with understanding, okay, I'm white. Well, that's actually a situated identity. It means that whiteness came from somewhere. Whiteness was formed in a particular way. It's supported in particular ways. It's agreed upon in particular ways. It's reinforced in different ways. So the idea of whiteness as a situated identity can also be something that contributes to an uncertainty, but it is clearly one of the most important things that's been happening in your ministries. It's also a sense that once people come to understand that they have an awareness of being white and that it's situated, then they start to try to manipulate it. They start to say, maybe I don't have to be as white, or they start to name things as white. And then they try to downplay their whiteness and maybe try to be not as white, you know? And a lot of that comes through what I see as an imagined engagement with people of color. What do I mean by an imagined engagement with people of color? I think that most of you know that our society is racially segregated, okay? The level of racial segregation that we have in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our businesses, in our friendship networks is about as high as it's ever been since the Civil War, okay? We have incredible segregation that's based entirely on people's racial identity. That means that for most people that we have encountered in the alliance, they do not have friends, long-term friends, relationships, or encounters with people of color. Those relationships, if they happen, are very, very small. It's like maybe one person, maybe two, and even if they're in the same church, it's not an active, deep, abiding relationship that people have had. It's something that is maybe one, if any. What I'm saying is the great majority of people in Alliance churches do not have regular engagement with people of color. And so, as they try to come to terms with who they are as white people, the only thing they have to work with is their imagination. So they begin to imagine, what would a black person say? Or can I say this? How would they respond? Or should I do this? How would they think about that? And so even when racial justice committees and task forces are coming together, they're trying to come up with ideas and solutions, but they don't have, often there's not another person of color around. And so they have to imagine what might be the good thing to engage with that might be something that they would like or appreciate or might be helpful to them. And that is a difficult process. That's something that often people have had to reach outside the church or consult the only black person in their congregation, let's say, to be able to talk about, here's this statement that we wrote. Can you tell us what you think? Or here's the thing that we want to do. Can you tell us what you think about this? And those kinds of things have been done with the right intention. They're saying we need input from black voices, but it also tends to create a burden, an unanticipated burden, by taking the only black person you may have available to you as the source of feedback for what black people as a whole might think or believe or respond to on any particular thing. That engagement with the imagination is particularly difficult because we tend to idealize things. We tend to get caught up in our stereotypes. It's difficult because we have nothing else to inform us. And so those things can be difficult. We know, and I won't go too far into the black experience, but we know that there are black people who've been very faithful members of their churches that have rarely been asked about their life experiences, that have rarely been asked about who they are as people, and they're not necessarily interested in just knowing somebody just because they're the black person who's most accessible to them. They would like to be able to be in an actual real relationship, and that people, that they're not just asked about things because of their race, of their racial designation, but because of who they are as a person. And this is a struggle that we see happening in our congregations, in Alliance congregations. So if you start to say, okay, I'm white, I know I'm white, I'm becoming to understand what I'm white, well, what does it mean to be a white person who is doing the right things, who's doing anti-racist things? And it has introduced a new role uncertainty. What do I, how do I act? Who am I supposed to be as a white person in my church, in my world, okay? And most importantly, we don't want to be like those white people, right? We don't want to be like those white people. We want to be morally upright in being anti-racist. That's why we're doing our homework. That's why we're listening to the speakers. That's why we're buying the books. It's why we're meeting together. It's why we're paying attention, right? But at the very least, we want to be not racist, right? At the very least. So that presents this moral project of being good and white. I think that that's something that drives the ethics of a lot of our anti-racist work. I'm not criticizing this. Let me be clear. What I'm saying is, as people understand that whiteness is implicated in a lot of ugly things in the world, we know this, and we know that religiously white people, that Christian white people, are implicated in some of the grossest things we can imagine in terms of racial oppression in the United States. And this is not just history. I'm talking to the Alliance here. So we know because we're paying attention to what's going on right now. This isn't history. This is things that are happening like right now. And so we want to be a part of a different way of being. And I think that sociologically, I have no problem calling that a moral project. There is a moral project of being a different kind of white person, and we want to be good and white. And a good white identity is minimally these kinds of things. One, it involves being culturally competent. What I mean is, I know what Black people experience, and I want to be able to be an ally for those people. I know something about Latinos or Asians. I mean, you could just go down the list. I know something about these things, and I want to be able to be smarter about how I talk, how I relate, how I can serve them, how I can be in relationship with them. What is it that might help them, and what kind of person do I need to be in terms of doing that? It's building a new form of cultural competence. It's also mastering a new role. I've seen this also as people talk about sort of like putting on a new set of lenses, new hats, new roles as they try to say, okay, if I become a person who's anti-racist, what does that mean? What do I watch? You know, how do I spend my money? Right? What kinds of things do I participate in? How do I vote? Those things are all a part of mastering a newly conscious role of being a good white person. And the third thing that I think is quite important is that we are desperately trying to avoid conflict. And that striving to avoid conflict is something that we also see as very pervasive in our churches, right? We want to be able to do it well. We want to do it right. We want to do it with gentleness. We want to do it with grace. We don't want to be judgmental, you know, and all of those things mean that there is a hesitancy of doing anything that would create conflict with people around us. And so when we look at the kind of anti-racist activity that's going, so much of it has to do with talking and processing and thinking and talking out loud and letting people share themselves in a safe space and talk and talk and talk. And that sense of trying to process and work through is because we're doing everything we can to try to lessen the amount of conflict that would happen. And part of the importance here is to recognize that all the anti-racists that we have in our churches, really, they are volunteer anti-racists, right? These are people who are doing anti-racist activity on their own, with their own efforts, their own time, their own resources. Volunteer anti-racists. The churches are not doing the work because the pastor is driving it. In the churches that we have been a part of, what we see and hear are volunteer anti-racists who say, this is important. I'm willing to take responsibility. I'm willing to meet with other people. I'm willing to join this group. I'm willing to plan. I'm willing to do things. When you have volunteers, though, there are things that come with that. Volunteers are generally people who lack previous training on race. They're joining it in part because they want to learn, They also want to learn. Or it could be, even if they do have a job where some form of anti-racist training or expectation is a part of it, they usually are learning at the same time. It's been a more recent effort. And then it's also people who are doing intensive and dedicated efforts that are largely unseen. Okay, so that means that people get tired, and people say, well, maybe somebody else can do it, or I'd really like somebody else to take over. You know, once you do this work, you can feel like somehow you've worked your way into a corner because maybe somebody else isn't quite as willing to put in the time, effort, energy of planning that you have. You are to be celebrated, but what I want to acknowledge here is the fact that you have been doing it as a volunteer should tell you why you feel tired, why you feel strained. Okay. It's something that you're doing on your own. Nobody made you do it, but you may have been asked, maybe you were recruited, but basically you have decided, yes, I'm willing to take that time. And that makes the work that much more difficult, right? So it's a passion to bring other people along that is so admirable among these volunteer anti-racists. And what do volunteer anti-racists run into? Congregational politics. What I mean by congregational politics is the fact that you find out very quickly there are people who aren't quite happy with this initiative. They have some thoughts about the thing that you just did, or they're not sure that we should be talking about it that way. I remember sitting in one meeting where someone raised their hand. The person who was the chair of the committee had just described how a 4-year process had led to a vote. The vote had already been taken. The decision was already made. And yet somebody raised their hand and said, why do we have to call it X, Y, or Z? It was just amazing that after so much congregational processing, there were still people who were willing to publicly say, I don't agree. I think this is not the right way to do it. And the volunteer is the one who had to stand there, listen to the question, and once again try to process with someone, this is what it is. We've already decided this is how it goes. And, it is what it is, right? I mean, it was said much nicer than that and much more eloquently than that. But I went to that person later that week because we had another meeting. And I said, I was so impressed with how you answered that question. You were like feet planted on the floor. You were so direct. Everything was so clear. And that person looked at me and said, yeah, but you don't know what I was feeling inside. When it comes to the anti-racist efforts that are happening among volunteers in our churches, there is a lot more anxiety, conflict, and tension that you experience that maybe nobody has seen. You have experienced it, but nobody else has seen it. So I want to first thank you for that. But we also want to acknowledge that congregational politics is a very real aspect of what doing anti racist work is because it was not anticipated in a supposedly progressive white church. There are so many things that you're already committed to that you wouldn't expect it. But people are not uniformly progressive in progressive churches. You find that out. And so they are in talking about anti-racism, what I think is a good way to put it is whether it's you or your team or the speaker or the pastor, you are deliberately introducing politics into your congregation. Why? Because we cannot talk about racial issues without involving disagreement, misunderstanding, contention about what things mean. We do not have a uniformly progressive view on these things. And so, as you press on anti racism, what you end up doing is you are deliberately bringing in politics. And I think that just about every lay person that I have talked to about that, I think they know that. I think they already know because they're in the church. They see what people are thinking and talking about. It is too glib to say, "Hey, just get up," or "Hey, just do." No, they are the ones often on the front lines of having to deal with the politics of their church in relation to anti-racism. Okay, and that is difficult. And so, what lay leaders, I want to highlight them especially, they want to continue to do everything possible to avoid controversy out of a desire to avoid derailing the entire process, right? It would be so much easier if you don't say anything. It would be so much easier if you decided, yeah, we don't need to do this, right? But you have chosen a more difficult path. And that difficult path comes because, and I've talked to quite a few alliance leaders about this, because y'all think it's the right thing to do. Okay. Like you have this imperative, it's a conviction that says, well, we think it's the right thing to do. It may not be, you know, the smartest in terms of church growth. It may not be the most strategic in terms of raising money. It may not be hard to say. Maybe it is. Maybe it is. But given the amount of tension and difficulty, we know that there are people who've had to really persist. We know people who've had to take a break from it. We know people who've had to step back because it was too difficult. And so the desire to avoid conflict is not about a lack of courage. The desire to avoid conflict is to try to keep things on track and to move it forward as best as possible. So resistance exists in every alliance church. In doing the work of anti racism, resistance is normal. It may not be the most public thing, but it's something that every congregation can talk about. One member said the anti racism piece is disruptive for a lot of folks. Okay. There's a lot more to say on that. Okay. All right. So, in the work of doing anti racism, there's an attempt to encourage cooperation and to avoid controversy and conflict. And the pastor, with messages and talking through things, willing to support the efforts in a number of different ways, meetings, things that you've done like films, watching films together. All of these things are meant to try to elicit greater and greater cooperation on what you're trying to do with respect to racial justice, and most importantly, ease the amount of controversy that would be there, and to avoid conflict. So I've seen a lot of these kinds of things. I've seen a lot of large groups meeting at tables, processing, talking through, letting people say literally whatever they want, and they will say literally anything. And out of that, sometimes it's like right on track, but there are times when people are not on track. Okay. And it's up to the lay leader often to say things like, I'd like to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you see. I'm curious, why do you think that is? Right? To leave things more open ended. But there's an attempt to try to process and facilitate by opening the conversation as much as possible. And whatever somebody may say, and these are direct quotes, then say, I love that point. I think that's beautiful. I appreciate those thoughts. Thank you for that, right? Because the desire is to continue to try to affirm as much as possible when people are at least somewhat on the right track, at least someone, to be able to get a sense that we're doing this together. So getting it right is an attempt to avoid disruption, to processing what's going on here. A lot of times there's an emphasis on data. We don't want controversy and conflict, so we don't want to give opinions. We give data, graphs, history. I've seen quite a bit of information, pure research being displayed on screens in churches by very normal people, like people who don't necessarily, they didn't come up with it, they didn't create the graph, but they found it, and out of their own research, they're like, hey, this is what happened. Hey, it's not me, I'm not the one saying, it's not me, I'm not it's like, listen to the Census Bureau, or listen to Dr. So and so, or listen to what the city government showed, or whatever. And they are showing data because they want to emphasize that it's a fact and not an opinion. They will also desperately try to make things personal and relatable. I have heard mothers talking about being mothers, right? About things with their kids and their schools and their desires. I've heard people talking about their neighbors and their family relationships. At every point, people do not focus on trying to be the expert because they do not want to come across as arrogant. They want to come across as, I'm like you, I've had to figure this out. I've experienced this discomfort. I had this experience. And then they're trying to share that, like, they've been on a journey and you can be on a journey, right? I've been kind of through this. You can be on that. And that sense of trying to be personal and relatable is yet another aspect in which so many of you, as volunteer anti racists, have been attempting to work through this from person to person, small group to small group over time. Okay. Probably the one thing that I found to be very interesting in terms of what people suggest is ultimately I have found that in churches where they talk about what do I do with my whiteness, they find whiteness to be a platform for doing other things. So let me see if I can help you to understand what I mean by this. Often, first of all, I hear people say, speaking as a white person. Now, that's not a very normal way to talk about things, but in the anti-racist work that I've seen people do, they often say they are a white person, and they want to speak from the standpoint of being a white person. Okay. They're encouraging other people to recognize that where they're coming from is as a white person. But then they go on to say, as a white person, there are certain things that I can do. So, as a white person, for example, you can confront another white person, or you can draw out a person who has been silenced, or you can ask a question of a person of color who has been ignored and bring them up. There's a sense in which whiteness itself is seen as a form of power, but it can be a tool if you learn to use it as a tool. Okay. In other words, anti-racist training at some point is not just recognizing that you have white privilege, and we won't talk about that, but the idea that somehow whiteness is a form of power that you have and you carry with you. But it's also the fact that because every white person has a basis of power, you can use that power in different circumstances. And so the encouragement in many places, as I've seen people develop this, is they are turning around and helping people to see that because you are white, regardless of whatever circumstance you find yourself in the world, you can be a person who can actually do something because your whiteness gives you an opportunity to to um, uh, to correct, to not accept things as normal, to not just kind of go along with the flow when it goes in the wrong direction. And the most important one is typically talked about as amplifying Black voices. The amplification of Black voices is so common that I've come to expect it in every church. Amplifying Black voices is when, for example, a pastor will say, I don't quote from anyone except for people of color in my sermons. Or I don't read people unless it's a person of color, etc. The idea is that I'm not going to listen to the voices that I've typically paid attention to. And if I'm not careful, I might surround my world with just white voices. Instead, what I need to do is to consciously amplify Black voices. And they do that out of lots of different decisions that they make in their lives, in their learning and reading, in what they do for group curriculum, what they do whenever they speak publicly. That's something that I see is very common. An easy signal of that is someone who wears a T-shirt and perhaps it has a James Baldwin quote, right? That is a way of amplifying Black voices. So amplifying Black voices, yeah, but using whiteness as a tool is interest. So the idea here is whiteness enables unhindered action. There's a belief that your whiteness gives you an ease in situations and in places that is less likely for a person of color. It's almost like, to use a really like just a crude metaphor. It's like when you take the stick of butter out of the refrigerator, it's cold and hard. But if your butter knife is warmed up, it'll slice through it very easily. The idea is that The butter is hard and remains hard for people of color, but it is eased if you as a white person can take your privilege to slice through things and allow things to move along so that then you can be of use for others. So you are instrumentalized. That's a technical term there. It's got a lot of syllables, right? Instrumentalized to advance equity and opportunity for people of color. And when I hear people talk about how they have tried to take the anti-racist imperative of their church, they try to take that and take it back into their everyday lives. They try to see, okay, I'm white, I occupy these roles, I'm in these places. Now, what can I do wherever I am to advance equity and opportunity for people of color to the extent that's possible for me, because I may have an ease in doing so. I may have a voice. Somebody may give me rapport, they may trust me in ways that they may not someone else, or because of segregation, they don't even ever are around them. So, in this sense, part of addressing the whiteness of our churches is ceding our ground in order to be able to advance the opportunities, the preferences, those things that have not been as accessible, to be able to raise the profile of people of color whenever possible. And we see this then happening in a cooperative manner, so that we start to see some really inventive and often inspiring stories of the ways in which this has happened in many of your churches. And many of you have spoken of the ways in which your church has helped to provide space or room for people of color, and how those persons of color have exercised incredible leadership, tremendous spiritual, ethical leadership in your congregations, creating a community that is more sensitized, and broadened in terms of the perspectives and the sort of sensitivities that would allow you to be the kind of community which most of you would say an inclusive community, or one that is open to all and closed to none. And so you're all doing the work. This is not everything that we have learned, but at least it gives a start to be able to say that these things are going on. There is an imperfect institutionalization that's happening in the congregations. We should not be surprised at this feeling of isolation that is there. We should not be surprised at the level of resistance we may encounter, even though it may not be public and may not even be known. Another example, pastor told me, because they happen to know about the giving patterns of their church, that the top 5 givers of their congregation had been intentionally withholding their tithes because they did not like the way the pastor was continuing to emphasize issues of race. That, in my mind, is kind of incredible, because basically you have long-term members who say we would rather have the church closed than persist in being able to hear these kinds of messages. That's the level of conflict that's happening in churches that goes largely unseen. But you're doing the work. You're doing the work. You're continuing on. It's still early days in so many ways. And we celebrate the work that you're doing and wish you well as you continue to do it. So again, Mark and Kevin will be saying more next week. There's more. And we're starting to write some of these things up. When those things become available in the future, we'll be able to share those in writing. For now, I want to once again tell you, Brian Harrington and the piece that I wrote, you might be interested in that. I wrote something else with Lauren Mayfield Jones out of Highlands Experience. If you are on Facebook, you can learn the story about Broadway Baptist. A local Texas newspaper told that story very well. You can look up Broadway Baptist and the story of John Thomas and their attempt to honor him. That's pretty inspiring stuff. So let me encourage you as you move forward. The work is happening. It's incomplete, but it continues moving forward. Maybe you have some questions that you've submitted. If you have, Alexis, maybe we can hear from you, and then we'll try to head towards a close.
Perfect. First, thank you so much, Gerardo, for that incredible presentation. Definitely looking forward to November 12th. We did have some questions. I'm going to start with one that may have been rhetorical, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Lynn said, if we don't feel conflict, are we doing it wrong?
That's a great question. I don't know. I'm going to see if I can unshare my screen so that I can come back on. This is a great question because have I done this right? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think you did it right.
Okay, okay,
Hmm.
great. So I appreciate very much your asking the question. One, this is a bit of speculation. I believe that some people really understate the amount of conflict and tension that they experience. And so, on the one hand, I think that I have been in churches where I have been told that there isn't any conflict, but then on the side, I've heard about some conflicts that have been going on. And so, I wonder if some people have been underplaying conflict. What I mean by conflict, that's a strong word. I don't mean that you're on the verge of a church split. What I mean is that there are different levels of tension and challenge that are occurring. The second thing is that it is entirely possible that you have not yet heard all of the experiences that are going on in your church. In communication theory, they say good news travels fast upward, bad news travels very, very slow. It may take additional effort and work alongside um, your lay leaders to have them understand what kinds of things may be going on that may not yet be reaching your ears. So I'd celebrate if there is no conflict, and I'm not saying that it's not possible, but what I would say is out of the pattern of our interviews, our observations, and our experiences, I would say yes, conflict exists, and that it's more normal than abnormal.
Thank you. I think I hear that conflict is healthy, which I agree. I think that's part of the work. Okay, and we'll try to close in the next few minutes. Thank
Yeah,
you
yeah,
all for
yeah.
hanging in there. I'm going to combine these two questions. The first one is the article that you wrote about the Southern Baptist Convention and the Alliance of Baptists being counter to each other. Is that available at a specific link?
Yeah, so thank you
Well,
for
I'll look
asking. Let
into
me
that
just
first.
quickly say thank you for asking. It is
Hmm.
behind a paywall, what they call a paywall. I am happy
Okay.
to give you a copy. So email Alexis, or if you want to email me, I will send you it directly. So I have a PDF that I can share with you, no problem. Any library, if you have a library university access, if you don't, no problem. Happy to give you a copy.
Okay, perfect. And if you're able to share it with me, Gerardo, I'll share it at least with our Thrive
Great.
cohort and we can share
And
it
I'll do
out.
that. Yeah.
Do that. Okay, perfect. And then the last question was, uh, will these findings be shared or summarized in written format?
Yes, so thank you. So what we have been doing is we've been piecing out a few things. I have a speech that I gave last year that talks about some of these dynamics, and it was written specifically for an academic audience because I'm testing some ideas in comparison with other people who also have deep experiences thinking and talking about race in churches of all over the world. So that is publicly available and no problem sharing that. I've also put out now three shorter things on faith and leadership. And those are things that also riff on different things related to our work. The one that I mentioned with you with our colleague and friend Brian Harrington is one that you could do. Eventually, we are also meeting with people. So today was a chance to share orally. The next time we're together is a chance to share orally. We may have another opportunity to or two to do things orally. Why? Because we are testing what we think against your actual experiences. So I have been sitting with pastors, lay leaders, some of our Thrive people, and sharing this is what I think, or this is what we think we know. And we don't want to claim big things until we have a chance to process more. So we're going to be processing for probably 4 or 5 more months to be able to get as much input as possible. And that includes tonight. From what you've heard tonight, we're open to any response that you have in light of that. So please email Alexis or myself, and we'll gather that because we don't want to tell a story that's not true. We want to be able to accurately share. I do think that what's going to happen is it's going to become a book project. There'll be something that'll be written up in a broader way that has already been vetted through Alliance church members, Thrive people who have been involved. Not everybody, but the people that we can sit down and work with. And we are also protecting anonymity, so a lot of things are not being said by name or by person, but drawing those patterns together. So that will be on its way at some point in time.
Perfect. Thank you. And I will close by asking the last question. I heard you mention you've written an article, or at least one article with Highland Baptist. Are you open, or is it possible for other churches, particularly in the Thrive cohort, to write alongside you so that we have more like written reflections as a part of the work?
I'd be thrilled. And I have talked with faith and leadership editors about sharing these kinds of things. They are very open. The reason why I like faith and leadership through Duke Divinity Center and funded by Lilly is that it is a venue for church leaders. There are a lot of church leaders that read that, and they are very interested in racial justice and anti-racism. They have a whole subsection just devoted to that. And so for 800, 1,200 words, it's not very long, written sort of like as a lead, something that's interesting, a vignette, supported, those kinds of things. They're very open to that. I'd be very open to working with people.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that would be great as a collection for the churches. And then I'd also be curious, not to put you on the spot, Pastor Jeremy, but from the Canadian perspective as
Uh-huh.
well,
Yes, of
I
course.
think that would also enrich the writings. So yeah, that's great. Thank you for being open to that. Maybe that's something we can discuss at the next Thrive cohort meeting next month as well.
Yep.
All right. Well, I think that is all. I'm supposed to take a group picture, but I
Oh,
already
that's
took
right.
it, so don't worry about it. I already took a screenshot of you all, so just be aware, maybe on Alliance of Baptist social media. You all look great. Thank you all so much for jumping on tonight. This will be a recording, so we'll share this out probably within the next week or so. Please put November 12th on your calendar for the next presentation. And for those of you in the Thrive cohort, I will see you in November as well. Thank you all
Thank
so
you
much. And
all.
thank you,
Thank
Gerardo.
you.
Have a good night.